History appears orderly only from a distance. In textbooks, everything has a cause, a date, and a signature. But in real time, events rarely unfold so neatly. Empires do not fall because of a single decree. Wars do not begin because of a single insult. Revolutions do not erupt spontaneously like thunder in a clear sky. There is always a preparatory layer, a network of agreements, people who do not act publicly, decisions made long before the majority learns about them. When these decisions surface, they appear inevitable, as if no other option had ever existed. It is precisely at this point that history begins to raise suspicion. Because too often, different eras rely on the same mechanisms. Closed circles, oaths of silence, internal hierarchy, symbols understood only by the initiated. In different centuries, these structures bore different names: orders, brotherhoods, lodges, societies that officially did not claim power, yet constantly found themselves beside it. They were either idealized or demonized. They were blamed for every catastrophe, or conversely, dismissed as fiction and fantasy. Yet the strange thing lies elsewhere. Even when specific organizations disappeared, the model itself remained. Knowledge not for everyone. Decisions not public. Responsibility diffuse. And the more complex the world became, the more it needed precisely such structures. Not necessarily evil, but almost always closed. It is here that the history of secret societies begins, not as a legend and not as a conspiracy in the cheap sense, but as a response to the fear of losing control over reality. Secrecy did not emerge as a conspiracy. It appeared as an instrument for the survival of knowledge. In early civilizations, information was dangerous in itself. Knowledge of the calendar determined the harvest. Knowledge of the stars determined the path. Knowledge of ritual determined order within the community. Those who possessed knowledge possessed time. Those who possessed time held power. That is why knowledge was never distributed freely. It was transmitted through initiation, through trials, through silence. The Eleusinian mysteries existed for centuries without leaving a single description of their rites. Participants knew what would happen, but had no right to name it. Violation of silence was punished not by law, but by exile from meaning. The Pythagoreans regarded number as a sacred key to the world, but instruction took place over years of silence. The disciple listened but did not speak, because a word without inner readiness was considered dangerous. Egyptian priests did not record knowledge directly. They concealed it within architecture, in proportions, in orientations, in the relationship between light and shadow. The temple was a formula, myth was a code, ritual was an instruction. Such an approach created closed castes, not because they sought to rule, but because they considered the world fragile. Yet with the expansion of states, everything changed. Knowledge ceased to be solely sacred. It became administrative, accounting, taxes, laws, military logistics. Now knowledge did not merely explain the world, it governed people. It was here that a rupture occurred. Secrecy ceased to be the protection of truth. It became a means of control. The Roman Empire understood this perfectly. The authority of the Senate was public, but real decisions were made within limited circles. Client networks, family alliances, and backroom agreements worked more effectively than laws. The fall of Rome did not destroy this mechanism. It simply transitioned into new forms. Christianity proclaimed open truth, but very quickly created a system of interpreters. Not everyone had the right to read. Not everyone had the right to explain. Meaning became multi-layered. The text for everyone, interpretation for the chosen. Thus arose a hierarchy of access, and it was precisely this that became the foundation for future secret structures. In the Middle Ages, most of the population could not read. Knowledge existed in oral form, and oral knowledge always requires trust. Who speaks? Who is allowed to listen? Who has the right to pass it on? Monasteries became repositories of texts, but at the same time, filters. Not everything was copied. Not everything was translated. Not everything was considered useful. Knowledge was selected. The canon was formed. The unnecessary was crossed out. This was not always malicious intent. More often, it was an attempt to preserve order. But any order has its price. Alongside the church hierarchy, secular closed circles existed. Guilds of craftsmen, brotherhoods of merchants, builders' guilds. They had their own signs, their own passwords, their own rules of entry. A master did not merely teach an apprentice, he decided when the apprentice was ready and whether he was ready at all. This was especially true for builders. Architecture demanded precision. A mistake could kill. Therefore, knowledge was transmitted gradually, through practice, through symbols, through oaths. It was precisely in this environment that a language understandable only to insiders was formed, a sign instead of an explanation, a gesture instead of a text. This was not yet secret societies in the classical sense, but it was already a system living parallel to official power. By the 13th century, Europe had accumulated several layers of hidden logic, religious, economic, professional, and all of them converged in one principle. Knowledge does not belong to everyone, and whoever controls knowledge controls the direction of movement. It was at this moment that structures of a new type entered the historical stage. They would combine faith, discipline, finance, and symbol. They would take old mechanisms and apply them on a scale the world had never seen before. Secrecy would no longer be merely silence. It would become an organization, and this would change the course of history. By the 11th century, Europe lived in a state of constant tension. The world was fragmented. Kingdoms fought among themselves. The church struggled for unity not only of faith, but also of influence. Roads were dangerous. Money was unstable. Power was dispersed. Pilgrimage to the Holy Land became a mass phenomenon. People traveled not only for faith, they traveled in search of meaning, and often toward death. The roads were filled with bandits. Local rulers did not take responsibility for the safety of foreigners, and Christian shrines were under constant threat. It was precisely at this point that an idea appeared that seemed impossible: to unite the monk and the warrior, prayer and the sword, asceticism and violence. For early Christianity, this was almost heresy, but the era demanded decisions, not theological compromises. The first detachments of protectors of pilgrims were few in number. They had no official status, they had no wealth, they had no political weight, yet they had discipline and they had an idea. The idea was simple and dangerous: to serve not a king, to serve not land, to serve an abstract purpose.
When the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon appeared, it looked modest. A few dozen men, minimal resources, clear vows. But the structure was built correctly from the very beginning. Rigid hierarchy, total obedience, absence of personal property. A knight owned nothing, and precisely for this reason he could be entrusted with everything. The Church quickly understood the potential of such a formation. The Templars did not answer to local bishops, they answered directly to the Pope. This made them a supranational structure even before the concept itself existed. The cross on the cloak was not only a religious symbol, it was a sign of jurisdiction, immunity, special status. The Templars could cross borders without permits, they could store money, they could build fortifications, and they were almost not accountable to secular authority. This provoked envy, suspicion, fear. But as long as an external threat existed, the order was necessary. It fought effectively, it maintained discipline, it ensured the presence of the West in the East. Gradually, the Templars ceased to be only a military force. They became a logistical network, a financial intermediary, an information node. People trusted them more than kings, because kings changed and the order remained. A Templar could accept gold in France, issue a receipt, and return the funds in Acre or Jerusalem without loss, without robbery. This was a revolution, and at the same time, the beginning of problems. Because money is not merely metal, it is power that does not require a sword. And when a military order began to control financial flows, the balance of power shifted. Kings took loans from the Templars. Nobles stored their treasures with them. The Church made use of their resources. An order that was formerly poor became one of the wealthiest entities in Europe, and at the same time, one of the most closed. Its internal rules were not discussed. Initiations were not described. Decisions were made internally. From the outside, this looked like discipline, for many like a threat, because the Templars did not seek the throne. They did not demand crowns, but they held a system without which crowns became fragile. It is precisely here that the cross and the sword cease to be merely symbols of faith. They become instruments of influence, and it is precisely here that history makes another turn, because any structure that combines faith, money, and independence sooner or later becomes a target. The only question was time.
Medieval Europe did not trust money. It trusted land, titles, blood. Money was considered dangerous. It had no honor, no lineage, no loyalty. That is why usury was condemned. The Church considered interest a sin. Kings feared financial dependence. The aristocracy lived in debt while pretending it was temporary. Against this background, the Templars appeared as an anomaly. They did not preach wealth, they did not display luxury, yet they operated resources that exceeded the budgets of many states. The reason was simple: they were trusted. A Templar had no family, no heirs, no personal interests. His life was subordinated to the rule. This created a unique effect. Money entrusted to the order seemed to disappear from the private world. It moved into a neutral zone. A person could leave gold in a commandery, receive a written confirmation, and be confident that months or years later it could be retrieved in another part of the world. In effect, this was a banking system without banks, without advertising, without laws, without competitors. The Templars did not merely store money, they managed it, redistributed it, invested in fortifications, financed campaigns. Kings quickly understood this and began to use it. The French crown took loans from the order. The English crown stored its treasures. Spanish rulers relied on its logistics. Outwardly, everything looked like cooperation. In reality, dependency was being created. Because debt is not only money, it is leverage.
And the more kings waged wars, the more they needed this leverage. And the more they needed it, the dangerous those who held it became. The Templars did not intervene openly in politics. They did not dictate terms, but their presence changed the rules of the game. They knew who owed, how much was owed, and who would not be able to repay the debt. In a world where written contracts were rare, such information amounted to power, a quiet power, without armies, without banners. It is here that the image of the order begins to form as a state within a state, not because it sought this role, but because the system itself pushed it there. By the end of the 13th century, the situation intensified. The Crusades were losing their meaning. The Holy Land was slipping from the grasp of the West. The military function of the order weakened, while the financial one, on the contrary, grew. The Templars returned to Europe, strengthened their estates, controlled the flows, and became ever less dependent on their original mission. For kings, this was an alarming signal. They saw beside them a structure that could neither be subordinated nor eliminated by a simple decree, because the order answered to the Pope, and the Pope did not answer to the king. This knot of tension could not exist forever. Sooner or later, someone would attempt to cut it, and whoever dared to do so would understand there would be no open war. There would be accusations, a trial, and words that were difficult to refute. The next blow would come not with a sword, but with paper.
Philip IV the Fair was not a weak king. He was pragmatic, harsh, and extremely indebted. The French crown lived in a state of constant deficit. Wars drained the treasury. The administration expanded. Old taxes no longer covered new expenses. The Templars were close by, and they knew it. Formally, the king possessed authority. In reality, he depended on credit. And the stronger this dependence became, the less tolerable its very cause appeared. The decision was not impulsive. It matured gradually, step by step, within a circle of people who understood that an open conflict could not be sustained. The order could not simply be banned. It answered to the Pope. It had support in other states, and it enjoyed the trust of the population. Therefore, another path was chosen, not a military one, a legal one. October 13, 1307 became a day that entered history as a sudden blow, but it was sudden only for those who did not see the preparation. The arrests took place simultaneously throughout France. This meant one thing: the decision had been made centrally and in advance. The accusations were formulated in such a way that they could not be verified. Renunciation of Christ, spitting on the cross, idolatry, secret rituals. None of these accusations had external witnesses. Everything rested on confessions, and the methods by which they were obtained were no secret. Torture was considered permissible, especially when the case concerned heresy. The body could be broken, the soul not. Such was the logic of the time. The knights confessed, then retracted their words, then confessed again. These contradictions did not trouble the court. They suited it, because the process was not intended to establish the truth. It was intended to create a legal basis for destruction. Philip V found himself trapped. Formally, he was meant to defend the order. In reality, he was under pressure from the French crown. Commissions dragged on for years. Testimonies became confused. Documents disappeared. But the decision had already been made. In 1312, the Order of the Templars was officially dissolved, without declaring it guilty and without declaring it innocent. This wording was crucial. It made it possible to seize the property and to avoid assuming responsibility. Grand Master Jacques de Molay remained silent until the end, and when he spoke, he recanted his confessions. He was executed, publicly, demonstratively. The fire was meant to place a final period,
but it left only questions. Because after the destruction of the order, too much remained unexplained. Not all Templars were arrested. Not all commanderies were emptied. Not all resources were recovered. Some of the property vanished. Some of the people disappeared. Some of the documents never reached the courts. Officially, the order ceased to exist. In practice, its legacy went nowhere. And it is precisely here that the history of the Templars ceases to be merely a story of defeat. It turns into a legend, one that lives longer than the organization itself, because destroying a structure does not mean destroying a model, and the model had already been created. The following centuries would only prove this. Official history favors closure, a date, a document, a seal, a pyre. But reality rarely stops by decree. After 1312, the Templars disappear from the records, but they do not disappear from Europe. They do not disappear from the economy, and they do not disappear from memory. Some of the brothers took new vows, moved to other orders, changed their garments, but not their skills, not their way of thinking, not their connections. Others dissolved into secular life. A former knight could easily become an administrator, a treasurer, an advisor, because he knew how to work with resources and discipline. The greatest number of questions remained about property. Formally, it was transferred to the Hospitallers. In practice, a significant part was never accounted for. Treasures do not vanish without a trace. They change owners or form. In some regions of Europe, commanderies continued to function almost unchanged, under different names, under different patrons, but with the same people. The situation was especially revealing on the periphery, in Portugal, in Scotland, in the German lands. There, royal authority was weaker, and the need for experienced administrators was greater. In Portugal, the Templars were not destroyed, they were simply renamed. The Order of Christ became the direct heir to the structure, with the same lands, the same finances, and the same methods. Under this sign, Portugal would begin its maritime expansion. Investment, planning, long-term projects. This was not a coincidence. It was a continuation of logic. In Scotland, the story is even more obscure. Some of the Templars found refuge among the clans. They did not create an open organization, but they passed on symbols, rituals, a language of signs. It is here that the myth of succession begins to take shape, not documentary, but structural. Because a secret society is not a name, it is a way of organizing, and if the method works, it is copied. It is precisely during this period that Europe undergoes transformation. Cities grow, trade intensifies. A new stratum of people appears without titles but with capital. These people needed networks, trust, guarantees, and they begin to reproduce a familiar model. Closed circles, recommendations, passwords, symbols. The myth of the Templars becomes convenient. It allows continuity to be explained, origins to be explained, to explain why some structures appear older than states themselves. From this moment, the history of the Templars splits in two. One, documentary. It ends at the beginning of the 13th century. The other, legendary. It is only beginning. Legend does not require proof. It requires answers, and answers always appear where history silences. That is why every new closed brotherhood is eventually linked to the Templars, even if centuries lie between them. This is not always true, but it shows the essential point. The model proved viable, and the world could no longer abandon it. The next stage of this story will not begin with war. It will begin with craft, with stone, and with people who built more than buildings.
Medieval Europe built slowly, but for the long term. Cathedrals were raised over decades, sometimes over centuries. The master who began a construction rarely lived to see its completion. This required a special type of thinking, planning not for a lifetime, but for generations. Builders knew more than kings. They understood the geometry of space, statics, proportions, the influence of light. An error in calculations meant death, collapse, disgrace, the destruction of reputation. Therefore, knowledge was not taught openly. It was transmitted through practice, through symbol, through gesture. The master showed rather than explained. The apprentice repeated rather than asked questions. Words were secondary. The sign was paramount. This is how guilds were formed, closed professional communities, with their own rules, their own hierarchy, their own trials. Entry into a guild was not a right, but a privilege. It had to be earned through years of work, through silence, through loyalty. Guilds had their own symbols, the square, the compass, the level, not as tools, but as signs of understanding. These symbols worked without words. They made it possible to recognize one's own, in any city, in any country. Itinerant masters traveled across Europe. They owned no land, they held no titles, but they had access. They were received in other cities, fed, given work, because the sign mattered more than a letter of recommendation. Thus, a network emerged, without a center, without a capital, but with clear rules. This network survived wars, survived the change of dynasties, survived the fall of cities, because it was embedded in stone, in temples, in bridges, in walls. Gradually, professional secrecy began to change. Craft became a symbol, and the symbol became a language. People who did not build began to be admitted into the guilds, who wanted to belong, who wanted to be part of the structure. Thus, a division emerged: operative masters and those admitted but not builders. This was not yet Freemasonry, but it was already its prerequisite, because what became central was not stone, but the idea of shaping a human being through stages, through initiation, through trials. Silence once again acquired power, not as a prohibition, but as a method. One who silences listens. One who listens sees more. One who sees more governs better. In a world where most people lacked education, such a structure appeared almost magical, but its strength was rational. Geometry does not require faith, it always works. That is why a new form of secret brotherhood would arise not in monasteries and not on battlefields, but in workshops, there where people were accustomed to thinking systemically and to waiting for results for years. When craft eventually loses its original significance, the structure will remain and will begin to seek new meaning. Thus, stone will become a metaphor, and construction an inner process, and the world will enter an era in which secret societies no longer carry swords, but exert influence no less effectively. When the cathedrals were built, the builders did not disappear. Only the need for their original function disappeared. Europe was entering a new era. Cities were growing wealthy. Trade was expanding. Education was moving beyond the monasteries. The old nobility was no longer the sole bearer of influence. Alongside it appeared merchants, lawyers, physicians, financiers. These people lacked one thing:
a place to meet, a space of trust, a mechanism of mutual recognition. The guild model proved ideal. It already had a hierarchy, symbolism, a ritual of entry, the concept of an inner circle. Thus, the lodge emerged, not as a building organization, but as a social instrument. The lodge does not declare political goals. It does not oppose authority, nor does it openly support it. It does something else. It brings together people who influence processes. Members of a lodge may belong to different social estates, but inside they are equal. This dismantles the old hierarchy and at the same time creates a new one. Ritual replaces title. The degree of initiation weighs more than origin. The symbol becomes a common language. The lodge does not teach facts, it teaches thinking, discipline, the ability to wait, the ability to remain silent. In the 17th century, these structures spread especially rapidly. The reason is simple. The world is becoming more complex and requires horizontal connections. Royal power is vertical, it is slow and often inefficient. Lodges operate differently. They are flexible, adaptive, informal. Through them pass ideas, plans, recommendations, decisions. None of these carries the lodge's signature, but their bearers recognize one another. That is why Freemasonry is so difficult to define. It is not a conspiracy, and it is not a party. It is an environment, a network, a form of organization for people who think in long spans of time. Within lodges, philosophy is discussed, science, morality, but the consequences of these conversations extend beyond the walls, because people accustomed to structured thinking begin to apply it in politics, in economics, in governance. Thus, Freemasonry becomes a school of elites, not hereditary, but functional. This provokes fear, because for the first time in history, influence begins to be based not on blood, but on access to a network. The church sees a threat in this. Kings see a competition. The people see something incomprehensible. Secrecy once again becomes an irritant, and any closed structure begins to attract rumors. But the main transformation occurs quietly. Masonic principles begin to penetrate state institutions, into legal codes, into constitutions, into models of governance. Equality before the law, separation of powers, rational order. These ideas are not born in the lodges, but it is there that they are structured and transmitted. The lodge does not rule the world, it teaches how to rule. And that is precisely why the centuries that follow will be for it both a time of flourishing and a time of persecution. Because wherever a new model of influence appears, resistance inevitably follows.
When the old order begins to waver, a need for a new language emerges. Not slogans, not proclamations, but logic. The 18th century became precisely such a moment. Monarchies rested on tradition, the church on authority, but the world was already thinking differently. The economy was changing faster than politics. Educated people no longer wanted to be subjects, they wanted to be participants. Masonic lodges did not create revolutions. They created an environment in which revolutionary ideas became possible. In the lodges, people learned to speak without shouting, to argue without bloodshed, to think not in categories of loyalty, but in categories of principles. This had consequences. The French Revolution was not a Masonic project,
But among its ideologues were many people familiar with this culture of thought. Equality, fraternity, law instead of the will of a monarch. These formulas were not secret, but the path toward them passed through closed discussions. The same process was unfolding in North America. The colonies were seeking a form of self-government, and they did not find it in medieval models. Some of the founders of the United States were Freemasons, some were not, but all of them were thinking within the same intellectual field. Separation of powers, a system of checks and balances, the primacy of law. Freemasonry did not dictate decisions, it shaped cadres. It was precisely this that provoked the greatest fear among the old elites. Because one can fight an army, but an idea is far more difficult to confront. The Catholic Church condemned Freemasonry, not for specific actions, but for the very principle of autonomous thinking. Monarchies restricted the activity of lodges because they could not control them. The people picked up rumors because they did not understand how influence works without orders. Thus emerged the image of a worldwide conspiracy, simple, convenient, emotional. In reality, however, the situation was more complex. Freemasonry was not unified. Lodges differed from one another. Ideas conflicted. But the external observer did not see this. He saw only closed doors. It was precisely during this period that secrecy once again changed its role. It ceased to be an instrument of organization and became a source of fear. This fear would nourish the next legend, more radical, shorter-lived, but far louder. The legend of a society that allegedly went further than all the others and stopped at nothing.
The Illuminati were not born in the depths of the centuries. They appeared late. They existed briefly, but they left a trace disproportionate to their actual scale. In 1776, in Bavaria, the professor of law, Adam Weishaupt, founded a secret society. Its goal was clear: the struggle against dogmatism, the influence of the church, intellectual inertia. Weishaupt was not a mystic, he was a rationalist. His Illuminati did not worship symbols, they used them as instruments. The organization was modeled on Masonic lodges, hierarchy, initiation, internal degrees. But the ideology was harsher and less tolerant of compromise. The Illuminati believed that society could be reprogrammed through education, through control of information, through gradual penetration into institutions. This was dangerous, not because they possessed real power, but because they openly articulated their intentions. The society expanded rapidly, absorbed lodges, recruited intellectuals, lawyers, officials. But this very expansion became the cause of its downfall. The Bavarian authorities saw a threat. The church saw heresy. The monarchy saw a subversion of foundations. In 1785, the Illuminati were banned. Their archives were confiscated. Their correspondence was made public. And then something strange happened. The documents did not destroy the myth, they gave birth to it. Because in the letters, people found what everyone feared: plans, strategies, a language of control. Reality was more mundane. The Illuminati did not manage to realize anything. They were too straightforward, too ideological. But after their prohibition, the myth began to live independently. The Illuminati became a symbol of an absolute conspiracy, of the secret hand of history. They began to be linked to revolutions, to coups, to the fall of monarchies, although at the time of these events, the Illuminati no longer existed. This revealed an important truth.
A secret society can die, but the idea of it cannot. The myth proved stronger than facts because it responded to fears, not to questions. And it is precisely from this moment that a new era begins, an era in which secret societies exist not only in reality, but also in the mass imagination. And this imagination will begin to live its own life.
A myth becomes dangerous when people begin to believe in it more than in facts, especially if this myth is simple and explains a complex world with a single sentence. At the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, Europe experiences shock. Revolutions, executions of kings, the collapse of old orders. Society needs someone to blame. Not an abstract process, not economic change, but a concrete force. Secret societies are perfectly suited to this role. They are invisible, closed, unable to defend themselves publicly. Anti-Masonic treatises fill Europe. Pamphlets describe networks no one has ever seen. They assign a single center where none existed. Freemasons begin to be blamed for everything. For revolutions, for the fall of monarchies, for the destruction of morality. The Illuminati are added to this image as a final stroke. They become a symbol of absolute evil, although in reality they were only an episode. The myth is convenient for power. It allows one not to acknowledge one's own mistakes, not to speak about inequality, not to speak about a crisis of governance. It is enough to point to a secret center, and fear will do the rest. The paradox lies in the fact that Masonic lodges during this period are often loyal to the state. They do not call for uprisings, they adapt. But the public image already lives separately, and it cannot be controlled. It is precisely at this moment that secret societies finally move into the sphere of mass imagination. Real structures recede into the background. Fear steps onto the stage. Fear of invisible governance. Fear that decisions are made without the participation of the majority. Fear of losing control over one's own life. This fear is universal. It does not depend on country or on century, and it will be used again and again in different forms, under different names. Thus, myth ceases to be a byproduct of history. It becomes an instrument, just like secrecy once was, and this instrument will outlive its creators. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world accelerated sharply. What had previously changed over generations now collapsed within decades. Empires fell, borders multiplied, wars did as well. In this new reality, classical secret societies began to lose their meaning. The world became too large, too complex, too transparent for old forms. Lodges continued to exist, but they no longer defined the direction of history. Orders remained symbols, not centers of influence. The reason was simple. Power changed its form. If previously it was concentrated in people, now it was concentrated in systems. State apparatuses expanded. Bureaucracy became a profession. Decisions began to be made not in circles of the initiated, but in offices with nameplates on the doors. But this did not mean that the principle of closedness disappeared. It simply moved to another level. Instead of secret brotherhoods, committees appeared. Instead of oaths, security clearances. Instead of symbols, the stamp classified. The world learned to conceal not the fact of a decision itself, but the mechanism by which it was made. The two world wars demonstrated this with particular clarity. Strategic plans were not discussed publicly. Real motives were often masked by ideology, and responsibility was diluted among institutions. After the Second World War, a new type of influence took shape: supranational, technocratic, rational. International organizations, financial institutions, analytical centers. They are not secret in the classical sense. Their names are known, their offices are open, but their internal logic remains inaccessible to the majority. Who sets the agenda? Who defines the limits of what is possible? Who decides which issues are discussed and which are not? These decisions are not made in public squares and not at polling stations. It is precisely at this moment that the mass imagination returns once again to old images: Templars, Freemasons, Illuminati, because they are simpler than complex reality. It is far easier to believe in a secret brotherhood than in an impersonal system. It is easier to imagine a group of people in robes than a network of economic interests, regulations, dependencies. Thus, modern conspiracy thinking is born. It is no longer about history. It is about fear of complexity. Within it, secret societies serve as archetypes. They explain everything and demand nothing in return. Because if the world is controlled by a secret conspiracy, personal responsibility disappears. But reality is less mystical, and at the same time, less comforting. Modern power rarely has a center. It is distributed, fragmented, and precisely for that reason it appears uncontrollable. Decisions are made at the intersection of economics, politics, technology, information. And in this system, there is no single order. There are only rules of access. Who has access to information? Who possesses analytics? Who controls the flows? This is a new form of initiation, without rituals, without symbols, but with the same consequences. People inside the system see more, but do not always understand more. People outside see less, and therefore speculate. Myth once again becomes an instrument, this time a mass one. Media amplify it, algorithms feed it. Secret societies of the 21st century do not exist in underground chambers, they exist in minds. And this is precisely what makes them more dangerous than ever before. Because it is impossible to negotiate with a myth. It can only be accepted or rejected, and most choose the former.
Human beings tolerate uncertainty poorly. They can live in poverty, they can live in danger, but they cannot live for long without an explanation. When events do not form a coherent picture, the psyche begins to search for connections, even where none exist, or where they are too complex to be seen at once. Conspiracy is a simplification. It reduces chaos to a single cause, to a single center, to a single will. The world becomes more comprehensible, even if this comprehensibility is false. Historically, conspiracies emerge in moments of crisis, when familiar structures collapse, when old rules stop working, and new ones have not yet taken shape. It is precisely then that a sense of lost control appears, and along with it, the need to find someone who possesses that control. Secret societies fit this role perfectly. They are anonymous. They are closed. They do not answer questions. Psychology works simply. If I do not see the mechanism, then it is being hidden. If it is being hidden, then someone is interested. Thus, the logic of suspicion is formed. The human brain dislikes randomness. It searches for intention, even in natural disasters, even in economic cycles, even in diseases. Conspiracy gives intention a face, and once there is a face, there is also an enemy. This relieves inner tension, because one can fight an enemy, even if it is imaginary. Within this scheme, secret societies become a convenient container for fears. They absorb everything: inequality, corruption, powerlessness, social injustice. Instead of analyzing the system, the image of a puppeteer appears. But real systems are more complex. They have no single center. They consist of interactions of interests, compromises, mistakes. This is difficult to accept because then responsibility is distributed and part of it falls on everyone. Conspiracy relieves one of this burden. It says, you are not to blame. You are being controlled. That is why conspiracies are so resilient. They are psychologically comfortable. In conspiratorial thinking, secret societies are always omnipotent. Otherwise, they do not fulfill their function. If a conspiracy can make mistakes, it ceases to be an explanation. That is why in conspiracy thinking, there are no failures. Any mistake is part of the plan. Any exposure is a cover. This is a closed circle from which there is no logical exit. Societies with low levels of trust are especially vulnerable to this kind of thinking. Trust in the state, in institutions, in experts. When official explanations appear unconvincing, alternative versions become more attractive. And here, old names return once again. Templars, Freemasons, Illuminati. They are convenient because they possess historical depth, symbolism, mythology. This gives conspiracy a sense of solidity. It appears ancient and therefore supposedly proven by time. But history does not confirm this. It shows something else. Secret societies existed. Some of them had real influence, but none of them ruled the world. Their influence was always limited by context, by era, by resources, by the human factor. The world changed not because of a single conspiracy, but because of a combination of decisions, often contradictory, often mistaken. Accepting this is more difficult because then the simple narrative disappears. The clear line between good and evil disappears. But it is precisely here that an adult view of history begins. Secret societies are not demonic forces and not innocent clubs. They are instruments. They appear where society fails to cope with open forms of governance. And as long as this problem remains unresolved, conspiracy will return, in new forms, under new names, because fear of the unseen is one of the oldest human fears.
The question of who governs the world sounds simple, but it is precisely this simplicity that makes it dangerous, because the real answer is complex and does not fit into a single figure, nor into a single order, nor into a single conspiracy. In the modern world, power has no throne. It does not sit in a capital city, and it does not wear a robe. It is distributed. Decisions are made at the intersection of interests: economic, political, technological, informational. None of these factors is self-sufficient. Each depends on the others. And it is precisely this interdependence that creates the illusion of an invisible center. The economy dictates the boundaries of what is possible, but it does not determine concrete actions. Politics makes decisions, but it is constrained by resources. Technologies accelerate processes, but they do not define values. In this system, there is no chief conductor. There are many orchestras playing simultaneously and not always in the same rhythm. Financial markets react to expectations. Expectations are formed by information. Information depends on channels of distribution. Channels depend on algorithms. Algorithms have no ideology, but they have logic. And this logic is often stronger than political will. States attempt to control processes through laws, regulations, international agreements, but the global world does not respect borders. Capital moves faster than parliamentary decisions. Ideas spread faster than censorship. Crises arise earlier than response plans.
It is precisely here that the temptation to find a secret center appears, because chaos is difficult to accept, and complexity is even harder. But reality is different. The world is governed not by conspiracy, but by compromises. Compromises between corporations and states, between voters and elites, between short-term gain and long-term risks. These compromises are not always just, often painful, and almost always opaque to the majority. It is this opacity that creates the sense of conspiracy. When a person does not see the logic of decisions, they assume malicious intent, because malicious intent is simpler than a complex system. In this sense, modern institutions fulfill the role once held by secret societies. They do not hide intentionally, but their language is inaccessible. Financial reports, analytical models, legal formulas. For most people, this is just as closed as symbols and rituals once were. The only difference is that now the barrier is not an oath of silence, but the level of competence. Those who possess analytics see opportunities earlier. Those who possess information react faster. Those who have access to networks exert influence indirectly. This is not conspiracy, it is asymmetry. Asymmetry of access, asymmetry of knowledge, asymmetry of speed. It is precisely this that shapes modern power. There are no secret initiations here, but there are informal rules, recommendations, closed meetings, interest-based clubs. They do not govern the world, but they coordinate actions. Historically, people have always gathered in circles. This does not change, only the scale changes. Therefore, the attempt to explain the modern world through Templars or Illuminati is an attempt to view a metropolis through the map of a medieval town. It is comforting, but it does not help with orientation. Real power today is the ability to shape frameworks. Frameworks of discussion, frameworks of what is permissible, frameworks of the future. Who determines what is talked about? Who decides which topics matter? Who sets priorities? This is the modern form of control. It is not secret, but it is difficult to comprehend. And that is precisely why myths about secret societies do not disappear. They compensate for cognitive fatigue. They provide a simple answer where systemic thinking is required. The world is not governed from a single room. It is governed by many simultaneous processes, and none of them is fully controllable. This is not mystical, but it is unsettling, because then it becomes clear that stability is not a given, but the result of constant balancing, and that responsibility cannot be shifted onto a mythical order. It is distributed, just like power. A symbol always precedes an order. Before a person obeys, they must first accept something internally. Words persuade, symbols shape. This was understood long before the emergence of secret societies. Tribal signs, totems, religious images. A symbol does not explain, it fixes meaning and makes it stable. That is why secret societies have always used symbols, not for decoration, but for encoding. The Templar cross was not only a sign of faith, it signified belonging, jurisdiction, access. The compass and square among Freemasons were not tools of labor, they were tools of thought, measure, boundary, order. Symbols operate on a level where logic is powerless. They bypass arguments and address sensation directly. That is why a symbol is always stronger than text. Text requires time. A symbol is instantaneous. Within closed structures, a symbol performs several functions at once. It is a password, a marker of identity, and a means of discipline. A person who accepts a symbol accepts the rules of the game, even if they cannot articulate them. There is no mysticism in this. It is psychology. The modern world considers itself rational, But symbols have not disappeared anywhere. They have simply changed form. Corporate logos, national flags, application icons. They operate according to the same principle. They evoke trust or rejection. They form loyalty. A person does not analyze every decision. They orient themselves by familiar signs. This saves energy and at the same time creates dependence. That is why the struggle for symbols is always fierce, because whoever controls the symbol influences behavior. In the past, this was understood intuitively. Today, systematically. Political movements work with visual language, brands with emotional associations, media with images that imprint themselves. This is not a conspiracy, it is a technology. Secret societies were simply the first to demonstrate its effectiveness. Others followed. The pyramid with the eye became a symbol of conspiracy, not because it hides something, but because its form is simple, clear, and associated with hierarchy. The eye with control, the pyramid with structure. Together, they create a complete image. Human imagination fills in the rest. In this sense, symbols live a life of their own. They detach from their original meaning and acquire new ones. Thus, the Templars transformed from a historical order into an icon of conspiracy. Thus, Freemasons shifted from a philosophical milieu into a secret government. Thus, the Illuminati, from an episode of the 18th century, became an eternal fear. A symbol does not require precision. It requires repetition. The more often an image appears, the more real it seems, even without evidence. This is used consciously and unconsciously. A person living in an information-saturated environment searches for points of support. A symbol provides it quickly. That is why conspiracies spread so easily. They have a recognizable language, simple images, clear oppositions, ours, theirs, initiated, uninitiated, controller, victim. This logic is very old and very effective. Secret societies of the past used symbols to hold structures together. The modern world uses them to hold attention. The difference is minimal. The consequences are broader. Symbols work until people begin to ask questions, not about the symbol, but about who uses it and for what purpose. And it is precisely at this point that history once again returns to a choice: to accept ready-made images or to dismantle mechanisms, because a symbol can be a key or it can be a trap, and distinguishing one from the other is always more difficult than it seems.
History begins with facts, but it rarely ends with them. A fact is a document, a date, a name, an event recorded by a source. Belief is interpretation, a connection between events, the meaning a person assigns to what they see. The problem arises where facts are lacking, but the need for explanation remains. It is precisely in this void that myth is born. Secret societies exist perfectly within this zone. Their closed nature limits the number of sources and thus expands the space for speculation. We know a great deal about the Templars, but not everything. About Freemasons, even more, but with significant gaps. About the Illuminati, on the contrary, too many rumors and too little real influence. These disproportions create the illusion of mystery. Where information is insufficient, human imagination begins to work more actively than archives. The historian is forced to stop. The conspiracy theorist is not. The historian says, "We do not know this." The conspiracy theorist says, "It is being hidden."
This difference is fundamental. A fact always has a boundary. It is limited by what has survived, by what was recorded, by what can be verified. Belief has no boundaries. It can expand endlessly, and that is precisely why it seems stronger. It is difficult for a person to accept the phrase, "We will never know this." It sounds like defeat. Myth offers an alternative. It provides closure, even if that closure is invented. That is why stories about hidden archives, secret libraries, forbidden knowledge are so attractive. They create the feeling that truth exists. It is simply inaccessible. This is psychologically more comfortable than acknowledging randomness or the limitations of human memory. The boundary between fact and belief does not run through sources. It runs through the mind. It appears at the moment when a person stops verifying and begins to believe because it is easier. The history of secret societies shows this very clearly. Real structures with concrete goals are transformed into universal explanations for everything. The Templars, from a military financial order, become guardians of absolute knowledge. Freemasons, from a philosophical milieu, become a secret government. The Illuminati, from a Bavarian experiment, become an eternal shadow over the world. These transformations have no factual basis, but they have a need beneath them, a need for clarity, a need for control, a need for complex reality to have a simple scheme. Facts work differently. They rarely confirm a complete picture. More often, they shatter it. And that is why fact often loses to belief, because fact is inconvenient. It does not provide ready-made answers. It demands effort, context, knowledge of the era. Belief demands nothing. It is simply accepted. In this sense, conspiracies are a form of modern belief, without temples, without priests, but with dogmas. Any attempt at doubt is perceived as hostile. Any fact that doesn't fit is ignored. Thus, a closed system is formed, similar to religion, but without ethics. History cannot fight belief directly. It can only offer tools, context, comparison, critical thinking. This is a slow process, and it never produces instant results. But this is precisely what separates research from fantasy, explanation from justification, understanding from consolation. The boundary between fact and belief will always be movable. It changes together with society, with the level of education, with access to information. But it exists, and it can be felt. At the moment when an answer stops generating new questions and begins to close the subject forever, that is where belief begins.
Every story about secret societies ultimately does not lead to them. It leads to the human being, to that moment when a person encounters something they cannot fully understand and is forced to choose a way of responding. A shadow is always larger than the object, especially when the light is weak, especially when viewed from a distance. Secret societies became such a shadow for history. They cast it not because they are too powerful, but because the human being fears the void between events. In this void, questions arise. Who decided? Who benefited? Who remained on the sidelines? Not all answers are pleasant. Some require acknowledging one's own powerlessness. Some, one's own participation. Some, one's own indifference. Conspiracy removes these questions. It shifts responsibility onto an order, onto a brotherhood, onto invisible others. This is a temptation, especially in times of crisis. A person who believes in an omnipotent shadow feels like a victim, and a victim is permitted not to act because everything has already been decided. But history does not confirm this approach. It shows something else. Real secret societies had limited influence. They emerged, developed, disappeared. Their decisions were often contradictory. Their members, ordinary people, with fears, ambitions, mistakes. No order withstood contact with reality without change. No structure was omnipotent. No plan unfolded perfectly. The world always turned out to be more complex, and it is precisely here that the key difference between history and myth lies. History acknowledges limitations. Myth does not. When a person accepts complexity, they stop seeking the shadow as an explanation. They begin to seek mechanisms. Mechanisms of power. Mechanisms of influence. Mechanisms of manipulation. This is more difficult, but more effective, because mechanisms can be dismantled, and a shadow can only be feared. A mature view of history does not destroy interest, it makes it deeper. Secret societies cease to be frightening and become illustrative. They demonstrate how people organize under conditions of uncertainty, how they create rules where open mechanisms do not function, how they seek control where chaos reigns. In this sense, they are a mirror, not a cause, but a reflection of the fears of an era, its inequalities, its limitations. When an era changes, the forms of the shadow change as well. Today, these are not orders, not lodges, not brotherhoods. They are algorithms, financial instruments, information flows. But the human reaction remains the same. Fear, the search for a simple explanation, the desire to find someone to blame. Before the shadow, there is always a choice, either to stare at it or to turn back toward the source of light. Light does not offer ready-made answers. It reveals details, contours, irregularities. And it does not always comfort, but it is precisely light that allows movement forward, without illusions, without a cult of fear, without the need for an imaginary enemy. A person who accepts complexity loses tranquility, but gains freedom. And it is precisely this freedom, the only real alternative to myth. When the shadow recedes, the world does not become simpler, it becomes more visible. Secret societies leave the stage not because they never existed, but because they cease to be the main actors. History moves forward not through conspiracies, but through decisions, through mistakes, through choices made by specific people in specific circumstances. The Templars were a response to the chaos of the Middle Ages, Masonic lodges to the crisis of old hierarchies, the Illuminati to the clash between rationalism and dogmatism. Each of these phenomena had its own logic, its own time, its own end. They are united not by a secret purpose, but by a common condition of emergence, the inability of society to cope with open governance. Where trust is lacking, closedness appears. Where participation is lacking, initiation appears. Where explanations are lacking, myth appears. The world of the 21st century considers itself transparent, but it has merely changed the type of opacity. Decisions are made quickly, communicated slowly, and explained even slower. This creates the same effect once produced by orders.
The feeling that somewhere exists another level of reality, inaccessible, closed, uncontrollable. But the difference is fundamental. Today, this secrecy is not protected by oaths. It is protected by complexity. The complexity of systems, the language of experts, the gap between those who understand processes and those who see only consequences. In this situation, myth once again seems attractive. It is simpler, more emotional, more comprehensible, but it solves nothing. After the shadow, only one question remains: what to do with reality that does not fit into ready-made schemes? To accept it means abandoning the comfortable role of victim, to acknowledge that the world has no script and that no one guarantees a just ending. This is difficult, and that is why most prefer to return to the shadow. But history is not moved by the majority. It is moved by those who are capable of living without myth, by those who ask questions instead of seeking someone to blame, by those who dismantle mechanisms rather than settling for images. Secret societies will always be part of history, as a form, as a response, as a symptom. But they cease to be dangerous when they are understood in context, when analysis replaces fear, when verification replaces belief, when structure replaces legend. The world after the shadow is not brighter, it is more honest. It offers no guarantees, but it offers the possibility of influence, not through initiation, not through conspiracy, but through participation. And this is the least mystical, but the most difficult path, because it demands not belief, but responsibility. And it is from this point that the history of secret societies turns into a history of choice, not of orders, not of brotherhoods, but of the human being, the one who decides whether to live in the shadow or to step out of it.